Welcome to Distilling Arguments Part 2. In the last video lecture, we began discussing how we go about distilling arguments. As you should recall from the last video lecture, distilling arguments is identifying, isolating, and extracting the main thrust of an argument from a larger body of text. In the last video lecture, we walked through steps 2 and 3 in some detail, with special emphasis being placed on how to identify implicit premises and implicit conclusions. In this video lecture, we're going to continue this discussion, and we're going to talk about how we present or represent these arguments in what we call premise-conclusion form. Now, technically speaking, to distill an argument is just to extract it and to identify its parts. What we're going to be focusing on now in step 4 is how we present or represent that argument. And to some extent, we've talked about one method of representation already, which is diagramming arguments. What we're going to discuss now is how we put the argument into what we call premise-conclusion form. And as far as premise-conclusion form goes, this is something you have seen already. I just haven't given it a name. But is to just list the premises with the conclusion at the bottom. And this is a convention we follow where we list the conclusion at the bottom in the same way that you add a sequence of numbers, and you might put 1 and then underneath 1, draw a bar, put a plus sign, and write 2 underneath that. It's the same exact manner of representation. We list premise, conclusion at the bottom. One thing that is important to note about listing arguments in premise-conclusion form is that we arrange the argument according to logical sequence. If, for instance, 1, 2, and 3 are all premises in support of the conclusion, we place the conclusion last. If, say, 2 follows from 1, we'd list 2 after 1. So this is in itself pretty straightforward and simple, but it does deviate from one of the practices we've seen so far. When we began diagramming arguments, you may recall we just walked through the argument and we would number the propositions as we came to them. When we first started studying diagramming, for instance, we'd just go through it and then just add numbers, and we numbered things according to the way that they appeared in the argument. And this is fine as far as simple arguments are concerned, but when we start dealing with lengthier arguments, and especially when we start dealing with arguments that represent or contain more content, this can be very cumbersome. And so what we have to do is we'd have to reorganize the information so that we can see it all in a logical fashion. And we number, when we're doing premise-conclusion form, in the following way, where we put things into logical sequence. Now notice at the top, in the first argument listed up here, the conclusion is numbered 1, but down here the conclusion has been changed so that it's number 3. And like I said, when we put things into premise-conclusion form, we have to arrange them according to logical sequence. Notice that premise-conclusion form, this represents information, and it represents it differently than just a diagram. A diagram does tell us some interesting information. A diagram tells us how all the parts are working together, and it tells us this at a glance. When we put something into premise-conclusion form, however, it tells us the same information, but we have to actually read it, and that is not just so easy as looking at a diagram. When we look at a diagram, just in an instant we can know, well, how all the premises are related together. When we look at premise-conclusion form, it's not so instantaneous. But premise-conclusion form, it actually tells us in a certain way more information than the diagram does, because here we're actually reading the content, whereas the diagram merely tells us the logical structure of how all the parts fit together. Let me give another example just so you can see what I'm driving at here. Here is an argument we talked about before. Johnson deserves a promotion because he is an efficient worker. After all, he finished his project in only 4 days. Now, if we were diagramming this, we might just go through and just number each proposition 1, 2, and 3 as follows. But this isn't actually arranged in logical sequence. If you notice, the conclusion is listed first, and then a reason for this is listed second, but then the reason for number 2 is listed third. So if we were to rearrange this according to logical sequence, what we would actually do is reverse the order of everything that was said in the initial statement. Because if you notice down here, Johnson finished his project in only 4 days, hence So 2 is actually, as we listed down here, a conclusion that is drawn from 1, and 3 is a conclusion that is drawn from 2. Whereas up here, everything has been arranged completely backwards. And as I said, if we were to if all we were interested in is just diagramming the argument, we could just number the propositions that appear up here and then proceed. Because this is such a simple argument, it really wouldn't create any kind of confusion. But if we were to arrange it in premise conclusion form, we'd have to change the numbering quite a bit. And we could, once we put it in a premise conclusion form, then proceed to diagram it, and it would just be 1, down arrow 2, down arrow 3. So this is what I'm driving at here. When we first started studying diagramming arguments, as I've said a couple of times already, we just number propositions however we first came to them. And that works fine when we're dealing with really simple things. But when we're dealing with more complex arguments, or we want to arrange the argument and put it into premise conclusion form, we oftentimes have to reshuffle the information. I want to make another point in this context, and that deals with how we treat extended arguments. And as I've said several times, an extended argument is one that contains several sub-arguments, ultimately leading to a main conclusion at the end. And it's a very simple point I want to make here, but we need to always remember to group the premises and conclusions of sub-arguments together. If you notice by looking right here, 1, 2, and 3, those are a sub-argument, and then 3, 4, and 5, that's a second sub-argument. And it's very important that you arrange things so that they all fit together with the sub-arguments that exist. Basically, what you want to avoid is something like the following. Notice here that our one sub-argument is going to be 1, 4, and 5, and then a second sub-argument is 2, 3, and 4. And what is going on here is you basically start on one point, then you switch gears, and then you go to 2, 3, and 4, then you go back to the initial point you started with. And that's something you want to avoid, just because it's confusing to someone who's reading. In theory, or not in theory, but you should actually do this, you want things to proceed in a nice, neat, linear fashion where you go down, and as you move down, you build towards the main conclusion at the bottom. And so you should try to group your sub-arguments together in this way so that you avoid this kind of going back and forth, I should say, with an argument or the presentation of an argument. Now, you've probably observed this already, but I do want to make another point with respect to numbering or putting your arguments into premise conclusion form. And that point is that whenever you identify an implicit premise, you are probably, in almost all cases, going to have to renumber your original argument. So here's an argument, and I know you've seen it many times already, but Sally broke her leg, therefore Sally cannot go hiking. As we said, there's an implicit premise in this, which is that people with broken legs cannot go hiking. But once we identify this assumption, notice that we had to renumber our conclusion. We had to move it down to number 3, and then we identify our implicit premise as number 2. Now, I had said before when we were diagramming arguments that the numbers didn't matter, and that's true if we're focused on just diagramming. But when we're putting arguments into premise conclusion form, the numbers do matter. Because we want the numbers to, as I said already, to get higher, and the highest number as we move down, and the highest number should be your conclusion. So when we were diagramming, I said, I don't care what the numbers are, it doesn't really matter what the numbers are, but when we're putting into premise conclusion form, the numbers do matter. And something else that's important is whenever you identify an assumption, it's always important to notify the reader or to identify that assumption by just writing assumption in brackets at the end of the premise. I have it here in an uppercase letter sometimes. I mean, if you put it in lowercase, write assumption, that's not a big deal. That doesn't really matter. Just try to be consistent. If you start using like uppercase assumption or lowercase assumption, just do it the same throughout. Though having said that, I'm pretty bad about remembering to do that always myself. But going back to the larger point here is that when you identify an implicit premise, you will have to change the numbering, and it is important to have your conclusion listed as the largest number at the bottom. So the numbers do matter when it comes to putting arguments into premise conclusion form. Let me give you another example. We'll keep going back to this. And with this, again, we had our two sub-arguments. Now, I want you to look at this argument in a little more detail and see if you see any assumption the argument is making. I'll give you a hint. The assumption occurs from 3, 4, and 5. There are actually a couple of assumptions, but I'm only going to focus on one just because I don't want to get too confusing with the argument. But think about this for a second. Here's what the argument is saying. 3, 4, and 5. Language is necessary for advancement. Any attempt to restrict language could restrict advancement. This is why the censorship of books is always wrong. Notice the slide here. The conclusion starts talking about the wrongness of censorship, whereas the premises are only talking about restricting advancement. So the premise number 3 is language is necessary for advancement, and premise number 4, attempt to restrict language could restrict advancement. Well, how are you all of a sudden talking about the wrongness of censorship? Where does the wrongness premise or conclusion come from? So this has to be assuming something, and something like the following. It is always wrong to restrict advancement. And I point this out here because, again, this is an illustration of how we have to renumber. Go back a slide. 5 was our conclusion in the initial presentation, but then once we identified the implicit premise, the assumption, we had to renumber. Because, again, we want our numbers to build towards the main conclusion at the end. The main conclusion is always going to be your highest number. So this was just another example, nothing really new from the previous examples, just further illustration of how we do have to renumber. Oh, I forgot, I had this in here. But if we were to diagram this argument, here's how we would go about diagramming it. Oh, before I mention that, also notice I did list over here at the end my assumption. I write that out because you're indicating to someone else reading this that this was not a part of the initial argument, that this is something you identified and you included. But let's look at how we would diagram this argument, because once we put it in a premise conclusion form, we can diagram it. And it seems like it works in the following way. 1 and 2 combine to lead to 3, and then 3 leads down to 4, and then 4 and 5 combine to go to 6. So language is necessary for advancement. Therefore, I should say any attempt to censor language could restrict advancement. And then 5, notice here we put my A right here to indicate that this is an assumption. And this leads down to my main conclusion. So in a way, actually, we have several sub-arguments. I said 2. But we could actually view this as having 3 sub-arguments within it. If you think of, and you probably should think of 3 leading to 4 as a sub-argument. Now, I should point this out too, is that this could be read in a couple of different ways. You might read this and you might diagram this, and I don't know if it would be entirely wrong to put 3 plus 4 plus 5a leading down to 6. If you did that, I could see some sense in doing that. The way I'm reading it, though, is I'm looking at 3 as leading directly to 4. But there's some area for disagreement about that. But in any event, this is how you would go about diagramming it, or this is one acceptable diagram of this argument. Notice, and just a reminder, that when we diagram the assumption, we do list the A out beside it to indicate that this was not a part of the initial argument. Okay, now we come to the final step of distilling an argument, and this is what we call applying the principle of charity. Now, I list this at the end, but the reality is this is something you need to be doing all along, applying the principle of charity. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what is the principle of charity? Well, think about that for a second. What is charity? What is charity? And you probably, when you think of charity, you think of giving or donating, particularly money, maybe giving to charity, alms for the poor, sir, this sort of thing. And it is related to that notion of giving, but obviously we're not talking about financial contributions at this point. We're talking about something else. We're talking about interpreting arguments. And principle of charity is basically the principle of giving someone the benefit of the doubt when we interpret them. It is, as I say up here, as I define it, the principle of interpretation which states that we should interpret someone in a way that is reasonable given their context. Whenever someone says something, or most of the time someone says something, there's more than one way to take what they have said. And typically what you'll find is there is a reasonable way to take it, and there are unreasonable ways to take what they have said. And what we want to do is avoid interpreting someone in ways that are unreasonable. You probably have experienced this before, where you said something and someone was nitpicking at what you said, and you maybe replied and said to them, "Oh, come on, you know that's not what I meant." What are you saying when you say, "Oh, come on, you know that's not what I meant"? But you're just saying that they weren't being charitable to what you had said, that they weren't interpreting you in a fair or favorable way. And what we want to strive to do is to do just the opposite, which is to be charitable. We want to interpret people in a favorable way. And there are a number of good reasons for this. Number one is nobody likes it when people are uncharitable to them. And so you should not, for that same reason, be uncharitable to others. Secondly, whenever you interpret someone in an uncharitable way and you attack what they're saying, then you really aren't attacking their considered view. You're attacking what we call a straw man of their view. And it gives them a really easy way of getting around whatever arguments you come up with, and that's just to say, that's not my view. You know, if you're attacking a straw man of someone's view, then they can just say, I don't know what you're talking about, because that's not the view I hold. I hold this other view over here. And you end up really not engaging the person on their own terms. So actually what is a very good policy is when you're, let's say in an argument with someone, is to be highly charitable to them, because if you can attack and demonstrate that even the strongest version of a person's view is false, then by a logical consequence, all the weaker versions will also be false. So you actually see really skilled arguers, sometimes they'll reconstruct another person's argument, their opponent's argument, in a way better than their opponent initially intended. Because if, like I was just saying, if I can say, well, look, here's what you're saying, but here's a better way to understand what you're saying. It's a stronger version, but even that version doesn't work. Well, then by just logical consequence, what they initially intended and then all the weaker versions of their view will also be false. So we want to strive to be charitable just because it seems, there's a moral reason, you might say, which is that it seems unfair, untoward, or we don't like it being done to us. There's also a rhetorical reason, which is that we're not really attacking their true view whenever we're uncharitable. Now, as I was saying, there's typically a reasonable way to interpret someone, and there's also an unreasonable way. And when we talk about the unreasonable ways, there are actually two versions of an unreasonable way to interpret someone. And one is that of distorting their views in such a way that it is stupid or false or unreasonable or implausible. This is probably the way that we most frequently encounter people being uncharitable to us, where they completely distort what we said to make us seem like what we're saying was just absolutely stupid. And I want to give you an example from my past. I remember when I was in college, I was sitting with some friends and we were talking about this couple who had broken up at college. And, they were kind of the it couple. They were really hot. And I made some comment at the time, which I thought was very deep and insightful. But now I look back and it just seems utterly obvious. And what I said was, well, you can't base a relationship on looks. And there was a young lady sitting with us whom I really didn't see eye to eye with on most anything. And she said to me the following. She said, well, I'm a psych major, and I know most relationships do begin on the basis of looks. And I just kind of shrugged it off because I didn't really want to get in an argument with her. But that was a very uncharitable thing to say. My initial statement was you can't base a relationship on looks. And there were two ways you could interpret this. One, which is most relationships don't begin on the basis of looks. And that's the way she took it. And if that's what I meant, then what I was saying was clearly false. Because the reality is most relationships do begin on the basis of looks. Most of the time you see someone and you're like, hey, she's cute or he's cute, and then you make eye contact or whatever. I don't know, however you do it. But that's how relationships do begin. In many, many cases, probably the vast majority of them. There's a second thing I could have meant, which is that good looks can't be the foundation of your relationship. And if that's what I was saying, then it seems like what I was saying was obviously true. Because how could you have good looks be the foundation of what you build your lives around? And you'd be like, oh, you're into good abs and good hair? Me too. Oh, you like tan? So do I. Let's get married. I just don't see that being anything that could have a lasting relationship. So here's a case in point where there were two ways to interpret what I was saying. One, relationships don't begin on the basis of looks. If that's what I meant, it's obviously false. Or good looks can't be the foundation of your relationship. And if that's what I meant, it seems like what I was saying was true and quite plausible and maybe even just obviously true. She chose to interpret me in the first way, and it was a highly uncharitable move on her part. So that's one way that people are often uncharitable, where they just distort what you've said and make it seem stupid or silly or false. And that's one extreme we want to avoid. There's another extreme we want to avoid also, which is distorting someone's view so that it comes out obviously right. And you see this occur sometimes when people really like someone else and that person has said something which is pernicious or false or misleading or deceitful. And because I like that person, I want to say, no, 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 that's not what they meant. And I distort what they've said so that they actually don't seem like they've said something so terrible. You actually see this quite a lot in politics where, I don't know, maybe some political candidate, they'll say something and it's just wrong or false or just seems just despicable. But then the people within that person's political party, they'll say, well, that's not what they meant. What they meant was blah, 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 blah. And it's just a completely, it's kind of improper to say uncharitable, but it is not accurate to what they have said. It is overly charitable or extremely charitable, and it is extremely charitable in such a way that it actually is distorting what they've said. The reality is that, even the good people sometimes say things that are improper. Even really smart people sometimes say things that are wrong. And when we're interpreting people, we need to be able to interpret them in a charitable way, but also in such a way that what they said could be improper or what they've said could be wrong. It just sometimes happens. Nobody is perfect all the time, not factually, not morally, and not in terms of etiquette or any other measure that you want to throw out there. And we need to, when we're trying to interpret people, to make sure that we interpret them in a way that's reasonable, but also in a way that's accurate to what they've said. We can't distort them so that they come out to be true or they come out to be palatable to our sensibilities. That also is wreaking havoc on interpretation. So I want to give you guys an example so you can kind of see what I'm saying here. But this example requires a little bit of backstory and a little bit of explanation. But in philosophy, which is what I regularly teach, there are people who just for whatever reason have kind of a cult-like following, where there are philosophers who just surround this person and they just hold them up as just this kind of paragon of wisdom, you might say. Aristotle is one. Immanuel Kant is a person like this. Ludwig von Wittgenstein, he's someone who's like this. There are other people that when they say something that's just kind of improper, well, let me back up a second. And so when these people say something, they have this like kind of cult of personality, and their followers, so to speak, they just want to defend this person. It seems like at all possible costs. There are other philosophers that are very famous historically, and yet people don't surround them with that kind of defense. It's very strange. Like some people, it's almost like some philosophers, when they say something that is silly, the assumption is, well, we must be misunderstanding them. Whereas other philosophers, when they say something silly, the assumption is they're just wrong. So I don't know why that is, but Aristotle is one of these guys who kind of has been put on a pedestal by some people. And even to this day, you'll find people at major universities who will just straight up say, I am an Aristotelian. No, they don't follow Aristotle, with the kind of like religious fervor. I don't mean to indicate that, but they are deeply committed to defending an Aristotelian project, be it in ethics or being it in his other field of studies. Um, and I say that because Aristotle, in one of his works, I can't remember if it was a political work or if it was his work in ethics, but he said the following. He said, "Some people are slaves by nature." And on the face of it, this seems like a really despicable kind of claim. It seems like what Aristotle is suggesting here is that some people were just born to be human property. Some people just through their birth, their genetics, they are just slaves, destined to be the property of others. And that is very repugnant to our 21st century sensibilities. In this day and age, we have completely decided that slavery is an abomination, and that any hint of this kind of natural or biological hierarchy is just repugnant to our sensibilities. But not so for Aristotle. It seems like Aristotle has this belief that some people are just genetically superior to others. Some people are genetically destined to rule. Some people are genetically destined to be ruled. And this, like I said, just sounds very repugnant to us. Well, because it sounds repugnant, people who are Aristotle's followers, Aristotelians, they don't like this so much, and they want to make Aristotle a little more palatable to our 21st century sensibilities. And so what a lot of them have done is they've tried to say, well, no, that's not what Aristotle meant. He wasn't saying that, genetically some people are born to be ruled and some are born to rule. Aristotle was saying something different, which when he says some people are slaves by nature, what he means is some people are ruled by their passions and desires and not by reason. And if that's true, that's what Aristotle meant. But that actually doesn't sound bad at all. That actually sounds quite, and I don't know if insightful, but just honestly, obviously true. Some people are ruled by their passions. You probably know people like this, is that you'll lay out reasons like, oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't date this person, you shouldn't have this job, you shouldn't do this, and they'll agree with you and then just do the complete opposite of what you've just said, because they just can't, I don't know, they just aren't governed by reason. They can't do proper strategic long-term planning. And so if that's what Aristotle meant, well, then it's not so bad. The problem is, that's not what Aristotle meant. And I've actually talked to a couple of people who are world-renowned Aristotle scholars, and they're like, yeah, that sounds really polite and fantastic and really nice, but it's just not accurate to the text. Aristotle meant exactly what it sounds like he meant. Now, I want to point out this is that in Aristotle's day, slavery was the norm. In fact, truthfully, while we're on the subject, slavery has been the norm throughout almost all of human history. As old as we have records of humans existing, we have records of people enslaving other people. And in Aristotle's day, they believed in a natural hierarchy in a way that we no longer are willing to accept. So I'm not saying this to in any way, validate what Aristotle said, but I just also at the same time, he, like most of us, is a person of his time, and if we're going to pass judgment on him, we need to be very careful about doing that. See, this is a lesson in charity here as well. Very careful about judging him too harshly, given the fact that everybody around him probably accepted something like this to be true. So we can sit in judgment of Aristotle, but we do need to put it into some context, what he was saying. And this actually brings me to my final point here, is that we do have to consider context whenever someone is speaking. Because the reality is what is reasonable for a person to say does depend on who is saying it, when they're saying it, and what we can rightfully assume about that person and their level of education, their society, their culture, anything that contributes to the context. So let me give you an example here. So suppose I said something like, the sun moved behind the elm trees. Now if I said this, I mean, you probably wouldn't think much of it, but if you were to, I don't know, get really curious and you wanted to dissect what I was saying, you would probably think, oh, when Jesse says the sun moved behind the elms, He didn't mean literally that the sun was moving. Rather, Jesse, what he was saying was just a metaphorical, loose expression to describe the appearance of the sun's movement. In reality, it's not the sun that's moving, it's the earth that is rotating, which gives the appearance of the sun moving. And you would probably assume that about me because you would know that, like most of you, I have, a basic education and I have a basic understanding of astronomy and how the solar system works. The sun is at the center of the solar system, the earth goes around the sun, and the earth spins on its axis. The sun appears to move across the sky, but in reality the sun is more or less stationary, and we are the ones who are moving around it. Now, that all seems very reasonable. I doubt any of you would care to parse what I was saying in that level of detail, but none of you would think the following: oh God, Jesse said the sun moved. He's a complete idiot. He thinks the sun is moving when we're the ones moving. That would be an extremely uncharitable thing to say about me, just given what you can naturally and rightfully assume about my education. However, suppose someone said this who lived in, I don't know, medieval England, and they said the sun moved behind the elms. Actually, they probably say, yeah, the sun moved behind your elm trees, because that's how peasants talked in medieval England. What if they said that? Well, what would be reasonable to assume about them? Well, it wouldn't be exactly unreasonable to think that they literally believed the sun was moving and we were staying stationary. The reason for that is at that time it was very common. It was actually the standard view to think that the earth was at the center of the entire known universe and everything went around it. This was known as the Ptolemaic model, named after Ptolemy, of the universe. And so everything went around, or you might call it the geocentric, I should say, model of the universe. And we have now, through science, we know this to be true, adopted what we call the heliocentric model of the solar system, where the sun is the helios. The sun is at the center of our solar system. But like I was saying, at that time, it wouldn't have been uncommon for a person to believe that the Earth literally is at the center of our solar system. So what is reasonable here? Well, it would be different. For Jesse saying this, it would be unreasonable to think he literally believes the sun moved. However, for a medieval peasant living in England, it would be quite reasonable to assume he thinks the sun literally moves. So context really matters. Like I said, context matters about the person's education. Context also matters when we're interpreting people in terms of the genre in which they're speaking and what they're trying to communicate. Now, there was a very famous philosopher, probably the most famous philosopher of the 20th century, named Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, is hard to explain how important and brilliant the man was, but he was extremely important, extremely insightful, just a fantastic philosopher. I'm drawing a blank right now. I think he taught at Cambridge or he taught at Oxford. But in the British system, you're actually forced into retirement. I can't remember the age. It might be like age 60 or something like that. Well, after he retired, he came to the United States and he was looking for things to do, so he just started writing popular level works. And Bertrand Russell was a well-known atheist. He wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian. And he just went through and he argued against religion, argued against Christianity, as you might expect. And many of his arguments are good, but some of the arguments, you just scratch your head thinking, how in the world could a person of Russell's intelligence say the stuff he's saying? It's just so dumb. And I mean that quite literally. It was just stupid. And one example, he was criticizing the wisdom of Jesus. Now, I don't know if any of you have read the Bible or not. It doesn't really matter. But in one place in the New Testament, Jesus says something like the following. He says, "Unless you become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And Bertrand Russell was deeply criticizing this and saying this is just terrible advice. We can't be like children. Children can't do, advanced engineering or calculus. Basically, the world would cease to exist and progress would stop if we behave like children. And that is an extremely uncharitable interpretation of what was being said. Even if you're not Christian or don't read the Bible or anything, you don't have to know that that's not what was meant. If you look at the context of the passage and when this was written, Jesus was not offering advice on or recommending that we lower our intelligence quotient to be like children. Rather, he was saying we need to have a childlike innocence or a childlike faith, something along those lines, which is very, very different than recommending that we be have I don't know a lack of understanding of how the world works, so that we lower our IQ to be like children. This was a lesson in humility and in innocence, not intelligence. So here's a case in point where Russell, he was being highly uncharitable. He ignored the context in which this was being spoken. And this is the lesson I'm trying to emphasize at this point, is that you do have to pay attention to the context of the utterance. What can we assume about the person? What is the genre in which they're speaking? I mean, to say something, I don't know, think about the difference if someone says something in the context of a song versus the context of an essay. People will speak metaphorically in a song, and that's perfectly acceptable. In an essay, though, you have to be more precise with your words. And so you always have to look at the context of the genre, the context of the person's education, the context of even the immediate discussion that they're engaged in. All those things will affect what is reasonable to interpret when a person speaks or when a person writes. So as I said, we talk about the principle of charity, and this is something we apply all along. And the truth is, we were talking about this when we were talking about implicit conclusions, when we're talking about implicit premises. As you may recall, when I said when we identify an implicit premise, we don't want to overcommit someone. What that means is we want to be charitable to what the person has said. Remember, I said when we identify an implicit premise, we are by definition putting words into the person's mouth. We don't want to put words into the person's mouth they wouldn't accept. When we do that, we're being uncharitable. So this is something that is going to be in the background for any time we interpret someone, any time we try to reconstruct their argument, any time we are reading someone or listening to someone. We should always strive to interpret them and understand them in a way that is most reasonable. I just thought of this. I heard this quote recently, this quotation. It said, "Argue as if you're right, but listen as if you're wrong." And I think that's really insightful and applicable here. When you're listening to someone, you don't just immediately go on the offensive and attack them. Say, wait, this is what they're saying, but is there a more reasonable way to interpret what they're saying? Of course, you have to avoid going too far in that direction and making what they said come out to be true. That's not something that's required when we're being charitable. You don't have to bend over backwards to make them come out right. If they said something wrong, you should be able to point that out and call them out on that. But before you do that, make sure you've exhausted the reasonable possibilities that are available. So that's all I have to say about distilling arguments. The truth is you're just going to have to practice this a whole lot in order to get better at it. And even to this day, I still continue practicing, and it's like any other skill. Learning to play the guitar, learning to, I don't know, shoot a basketball. There's always something new you can learn, something you can improve on. And what I want you guys to do for your homework assignment is the following exercises. And you'll notice here I listed instructions that are a little bit more extensive than just what the book says. I want you to put these arguments into premise conclusion form, and I want you to diagram them. So make sure to put them in premise conclusion form first, because if you just diagram them, your numbering might get off. Because, as I said, when we're doing really simple arguments, we could just list the propositions as we first came to them and then diagram them, and that was okay. But if you're going to put it in the premise conclusion form, if your numbering is not square with your diagram, then it'll just be really confusing. So first put these arguments into premise conclusion form, then diagram them. Same thing with section C. Identify the implicit premise, put in premise conclusion form, and then diagram them. And then section D, again, put in premise conclusion form, identify any implicit premises, and then diagram them.